You've heard of Zeus, Athena, Hercules, but what if I told you that beneath those famous names lie stories so strange, so haunting, they were almost erased from memory? Think about the shows you binge after dinner. You remember the stars, the faces on the poster, the names in the opening credits. But somewhere in episode 4, a quiet side character slips in, says one line, and the plot tilts. A throwaway moment becomes the hinge of the season. Ancient Greece worked like that too. The marquee gods thundered and flashed, but the fate of cities and the private weather of a single human heart could turn on figures who rarely get a title card. Their tales survived in footnotes, on chipped pottery, in a lyric sung once and then swallowed by time. Tonight, we'll uncover 3 forgotten Greek myths, tales that shaped the imagination of the ancient world, yet remained in the shadows. A contest more dangerous than any duel, fought not with spears, but with hands and thread. A daughter lifted from the altar at the last heartbeat, her name carried like a secret through the corridors of power. A teacher of music whose song braided beauty with peril and taught even the gods to feel uneasy. These are not museum pieces. They beat with heat and risk and choice. They ask the same questions we do when the house is finally quiet. What is talent worth? What does devotion cost? How far will pride or love bend before it breaks? If you listen closely, you can still catch them. Not in the big marble halls with their echoing promises, but under the breath of the night. A loom tapping softly beyond a courtyard wall. Sandal leather whispering over old stone. A fragment of melody wandering the air like a moth around a lamp. We won't rush. We'll let the noise of the day recede, like waves stepping back from a shore. Streetlights dim. The world narrows to a circle of warm glow and a voice. And in that circle, the door to an older evening opens. Oil lamps flicker. The sea exhales salt and mystery. Somewhere in the near distance, a temple bell marks an hour that doesn't belong to clocks. Step with me onto the cool marble where stories travel faster than armies and last longer than empires. The famous names can wait on their pedestals. We're going to the edges, where the overlooked are waiting, patient, powerful, and finally ready to speak. The city exhales and the heat eases. Olive oil warms and releases its faint green-gold scent from shallow lamps. It smells like crushed leaves in late sun. Doorways lean open to the street, and the last bowls are rinsed with water that runs cool over terracotta. Somewhere, a sprig of thyme smolders, sweet and resinous, its smoke curling through a courtyard and carrying the memory of hillsides. On the flagstones, sandal leather whispers against marble worn silky by generations of feet. The sound is soft, regular, almost tidal. A hush, a lift, a hush. Night gathers without hurry. Overhead, the sky is a deep bowl, its rim catching the first cool stars. Below, the city keeps a low glow, the lamplight the color of honey watered with fire. From the Piraeus road, the sea sends a breath, the tang of salt and tar and wet rope. And with it come voices that travel farther after dusk, sailors singing as they coil lines, a call and response that rises and thins like smoke. Farther inland, ovens surrender their heat with a sigh. A potter's kiln clicks as it cools, tiny contractions like a chorus of pebbles. A dog circles 3 times on a threshold and settles. The neighborhood rooster, fooled by torches, offers one confused comment and then thinks better of it. The agora, emptied of the day's crush, holds the echo of itself. You can still feel the press of minutes on its stones. The arguments that spiked and fell, prices haggled down with friendly ferocity, the bright clang when someone dropped an amphora lid, and laughter leapt, unplanned. Now, the shouts are fewer but clearer. A late fruit seller advertises figs he swears are sweeter after sundown. A fishmonger, grateful for the cool, sings the inventory like a hymn. Bream, mullet, a striped catch with eyes still glassy bright. Somewhere in the colonnade, a coin skitters in a wide circle and comes to rest with an obedient clink. The Stoa's columns keep their opinions, bearing the weight of roofs and rumors alike. From the hill, a priest strikes a small bronze disc, one clean note that turns the air patient. In a side shrine, a wick catches and steadies. Fat in the oil trembles and then agrees to burn. The light is not loud. It gathers, pools, and gilds the edges of things. A wool cloak braided with salt-stiff fringe. The grain of a cedar chest. The rough lip of a cup touched by many mouths. A breeze passes, and the lamp flame leans, then rights itself with dignity. Every object seems to remember the hand that made it. The amphora's shoulder, where a potter once hesitated. The knife handle made for fingers quick and careful. The loom beam polished by decades of patience. Day's noise doesn't end, it thins. Market boys fade into courtyards, and their jokes lose their elbows. The clatter of carts gives way to the wooden knock of shutters. The city does not sleep so much as change registers. Even the philosophical talk, which during the sun's reign could be as sharp as olives, grows rounder. Voices lower. Someone kneads dough for morning barley bread, and the rhythm, push, fold, turn, sets a steady meter that other small tasks follow. The sweep of a straw broom, the measured pour of wine diluted with water, the soft beating of dust from a cushion. A mother's lull, half sung, flutters like a moth near the lamp. Marble keeps its cool. Touch the threshold, and the stone answers your skin, ancient and indifferent. A patient temperature that tells you how many sunsets it has known. Wool keeps its warmth, and if you draw a cloak more tightly, the grease of lanolin gives a faint animal comfort. Bronze on your wrist or in your hand wakes slow and holds the last of the day. The city has textures you could name with your eyes closed. The smoothness of a cup's inner curve, the bite of linen, the little drag of a papyrus edge under a thumb. Athens is never silent, but night makes it choose. The cicadas in the plane trees settle into a measured pulse that lifts and lowers like breathing. From a courtyard, a lyre lifts a few notes, the strings a little dry, the melody searching, then finding its line. Two old friends pass a wineskin and speak in the way of people who have learned that the truth, like good olive oil, floats best on top of gentleness. In the roofline, swallows rearrange themselves and reduce the city's map to perches and drafts. Somewhere, a storyteller clears a quiet throat. All day, words had to compete. With trade, with politics, with the sun itself. Now the margins widen. Stories step forward, not as diversion, but as duty. In those twilight hours, stories were not entertainment. They were a bridge between mortals and gods. A simple fact, felt rather than proclaimed. Across that narrow span, the weight of a life could be carried, one heartbeat at a time, into the listening distance. The lamplight turns faces into reliefs, the kind you find carved on votive stones. Cheeks and brows made gentle by flame. When a tale begins, the city inclines its head. You can hear the craft in it, even before the first name is spoken. A hesitation, like the foot on the first step down into a cool cistern. The audience shifts, a radius of sandals on stone. The loom in the corner ticks faintly as tightened threads ease a little with the night air. A child, not yet trained in patience, presses a fingertip into wax and watches it accept the print. The storyteller takes the measure of the moment, how the smells have braided, smoke, oil, salt, how the sounds have sorted themselves into foreground and ground, and sets the first stakes of a path that will be walked slowly, steadily. Beyond the walls, the sea keeps count, drawing long lines on the dark. Torches mark their own constellations along streets that learn to be rivers of shadow, lit from the banks. Somewhere, a watchman's staff hits stone in intervals that could be mistaken for the beginnings of verse. The Acropolis above is both present and not. By night, it is less a fortress and more a thought, a high-held word. The Parthenon's marble drinks the star cold and gives it back as a pale recollection. The distance between then and now collapses not because time is thin, but because attention is thick. The same muscles that once carried water from a fountain now hold a bowl of diluted wine. The same ears that once counted the steps to market now count the beats of a tale. Under the same stars, in air stirred by the same sea, Athens narrows to a circle of listening. And within that circle, a voice, gentle, measured, lays down the first thread. In Iphigenia, where the foothills of Mount Tmolus slope toward the plain and the river Pactolus carries its glittering rumor toward the sea, a dyer named Idmon kept vats that breathed color. In summer, the air above his yard trembled with heat and scent. Alkali, vinegar, crushed insects, boiled roots. In winter, steam lifted and beaded on eyebrows, as if the world itself were exhaling. He was known for his reds, the kind that made merchants close their eyes and hum, the kind that queens fingered before they dared to bargain. If you stood by the door, you would see his hands stained to the knuckles, his fingernails permanent crescents of dye, as if he had been marking the horizon with sunsets. Idmon's daughter learned the alphabet of color before she learned letters. She watched the way a thread drank and changed. She watched the way a bowl went from ordinary to impossible when the skein swam and rose anew. They called her Arachne, a small name for a quick child, fingers that moved without thinking, mind that refused to sit still. When she first touched a loom, the clumsy, warp-weighted thing taller than she was, the world clicked into a kind of surrender. The loom didn't speak, but it had rules, and the rules were beautiful. Tension like a held breath, shed, shuttle, beat, warp like rails, weft like journeys, pattern not invented but revealed, as if the cloth were always there waiting to be found. The weights, little terracotta lozenges hung at the ends of warp threads. Arachne liked how they knocked together softly when a breeze threaded the yard. At night, she would lie awake and imagine the weights as small moons, steadying a sky of lines. By day, her wrists learned to flick the shuttle through the tunnel of threads like a swallow threading a hedgerow. She learned how to count by feel, how to listen to tension, how to test whether a weft would sit up obedient or try to wander. Idmon, who had believed himself a man of color, began to admit that color without cloth was merely promise. Arachne grew into her seat. At 15, she could throw a shuttle blind and reach the far selvage clean. At 16, she could make a border that fooled the eye into seeing depth where there was none. At 17, she could weave a fish whose scales caught light as if they were wet, and sailors who bought nets next door stopped to point and laugh in surprise, like children startled by their own reflections. The neighbors whispered that the girl had a gift. and the old women, whose eyes had spent too long on fine threads, nodded with something between approval and worry. She had a rival, though she would not have named it that. Across the Aegean, stories kept arriving like cargo, balled up, uncrated, spread out on tongues. And in those stories, a goddess presided over craft. Athena Ergin, they called her, weaver, maker, mind of the hand. You could feel her in the straightness of a good beam, in the clean logic of a knot, in the way a pattern held. The women who came to Idmund's yard to bleach and beat and rinse would touch the loom beam and murmur a small word to the goddess, not as flattery, but as acknowledgement, the way a soldier touches his sword hilt before stepping onto a ship. Arachne did not murmur. It wasn't defiance, not at first. It was simple concentration, like a swimmer who forgets to wave at the shore. But as her fame widened, and the first payments that were more than comfortable began to find their way into the family jar, she listened to the talk around her loom and felt something start to rise. Praise arrived, not in poems, but in orders. A cloth for the temple, a shawl for a magistrate's wife with a taste for show, a curtain for a theater where actors would, in a self-contained miracle, make people believe and then release them. She learned that excellence makes its own enemies, not people at first, but conditions. Requests grew more urgent, timelines tighter. 2 apprentices, whose hands were quick but imprecise, made her choose daily between teaching and doing. She chose doing. Her father warned her about speed. Fast color doesn't bind, Idmund would say, palming a length of thread and testing it on his bottom lip, where nerves were honest. A day too few in the vat, and it leaches. Arachne understood. She could tell the difference between haste and flow. When she worked well, the hours slid past and left no ache. When she worked poorly, a single hour leaned on her like a bad creditor. She began to guard the entrances to her attention as if they were city gates. There were suitors, because there are always suitors when excellence coincides with youth. One came with a flock of compliments and a plan to move her into a bigger workshop, where he'd manage the orders and she'd do the rest. One came friendly from the market, a seller of grain whose hands were trustworthy, but whose eyes kept checking the squares of the cloth to measure profit. One came with poems. Those were the easiest to refuse. Arachne had learned what love sounded like when it was really hunger. She saw the loom reflected in their faces, not herself. What did she want? It changed, as wants do. At first, she wanted to make the cloth in her head real. Then she wanted to make cloth no one had seen before. Then she wanted to stand next to her work, without anyone asking the goddess's name. Skill is muscle, she told a girl who started sweeping her floor for a coin. You feed it, it grows. It's not a gift left on your doorstep in the night. The girl, Dione, nodded and said nothing. Later, she would ask gently whether gifts sometimes chose their doorsteps. There was a day when the temple steward came for a commission. The Hypaipa temple was not grand by Athenian standards, but it kept a good dignity. Cedar beams, a pair of lions carved into the step, a priest whose voice could make even a short blessing sound like a provision of law. The steward wanted a hanging for a side chamber, something that would please travelers and locals alike. The brief was piety that doesn't argue. Arachne thought of the usual: olive boughs, an owl, a spear that managed to be both sleek and gentle. Her hands twitched with the boredom of it. She accepted, because a temple commission buys a year of independence. For that cloth, she tried something. In the border, small, quiet, the way border miracles are. She wove not the owl, but the patterns of owl flight, a tight curve around nothing, a sprint through a lane of shadow, a hinge where the air itself seemed to consent. She worked with kermes, red and madder, a little weld for yellow, and the kind of brown you get only by boiling a root to silence. When the steward returned, he said the correct words and paid the correct sum. After he left, a traveling singer who had been waiting in the yard for shade leaned close to the cloth and laughed in amazement, the pure sound of someone recognizing a secret in open view. "You wove what the owl knows," he said. "Who taught you to do that?" Arachne, who had never suffered from humility in the face of praise, said simply, "I taught myself." That sentence found its way through Hypipa like dye through wool. By the time it reached the marketplace, it had acquired a rougher edge. She needs no goddess. By the time it crossed the river, it wore armor. Let Athena try her loom. The Lydian girl will not be shamed. People like to make a minor note into a march. When Arachne heard the braver versions attributed to her, she smiled as if confronted by a mischievous child. Inside, something agreed. Why not say it? Why not say the part that was true, at least for her? What her hands had taught her, what hours had made of her. Pride has a flavor that is hard to refuse. Coppery, a little sweet, the tongue recognizes it as food. Still, when older women shook their heads and touched the beam with two respectful fingers as if to make up the difference for her, Arachne did not correct them. She wove. Work did what work does when craft and hunger for it meet. It opened into complexity and peace. She began to invent a weave that made water not just shimmer, but move in the mind. She found a way to let two motifs exchange colors at the border without breaking the pattern. She trained Dion's hands to feel when the shuttle's nose had snagged a warp and to back it out without panic. At night, tired but triumphant, she would walk to the edge of town and listen to the river say old, cool things. She tried to imagine what a goddess would add to that sound. She could not imagine it. When the old woman came, it was morning. Arachne, hair bound, sleeves rolled, had already sent the day's first shuttle. The woman stood in the doorway like a habit. She had a staff and a shawl of no special color. She carried on her face the serenity of someone who had seen every kind of day and learned to bargain with each. "Child," she said, not unkindly, not as an insult either, more as simple measure. "A rumor blows about that you would challenge even the one who taught the world to weave. Take it back. Pride is a small fire in a dry house." Around them, the yard paused. Idmon stopped his stirring. Dion stared, her hands finding their way to her apron. Arachne did not slap the interruption away. She did not invite the woman to sit. The good version of her pride might have offered both. But her blood was up, the kind of up that arrives when a morning's work has gone well and the world looks easy. If the goddess taught the world to weave, then surely she'll enjoy seeing what I have learned, Arachne said lightly. If she taught me, let her claim me. If not, let her watch. The old woman's eyes did something like a blink and like a flinch. Learn grace, she said softly. Let your hands be loud and your mouth be quiet. The gods have long ears when mortals speak of them. Arachne felt the yard lean toward the woman and away from her. She smiled the kind of smile you can only use when you are sure of your next hour. If she hears me, Arachne said, then let her come. For a breath, the woman looked as if the staff had grown heavy. Then her face smoothed into something so clear It seemed made of stone and wind. What happened next belongs to another part of our night. The shift in the air, like the first hint of thunder. The way the loom's shadow seemed to gain a second shadow within it. The feeling in the chest of being counted. The way a mountain counts a climber. For now, keep the moment where it belongs, on the threshold between confidence and the cost of it. What we need to know is this. Arachne did not choose pride because she hated the goddess. She chose it because she loved the work and wanted the world to know what hands can do when hours tender themselves. She had spent years watching credit drift upward like incense, away from the bodies that labored. She wanted a word that could keep some of it near the ground. This is not villainy. It is proximity to power without a tutorial. Level 2. The social context. Lydia wore wealth like a habit it didn't have to mention. Gold in the river sands, purple in the trade routes, a sound coin in the palm. In the markets of Sardis, where Arachne sometimes traveled to sell cloth directly, you could watch the world learn to love exchange. Men there talked about value using the language of weight rather than wind. They liked money because it didn't forget. In this world, craft was more than adornment. It was how you survived the caprice of weather and war. A loom was part of the household's spine, like the hearth, like the jar of grain, like the knife you never loaned. Weaving was women's work, which meant it was crucial and undersung. In Greek houses, the oikos ran on the quiet multiplication of thread. A woman's dowry often traveled as cloth. A household's comfort draped from beams and bodies because hands pulled it from air and plant and patient animal. Arachne's excellence was therefore political. When the magistrate's wife wore her shawl, she wasn't just warm. She was making a statement about which household could command whose hours, which stories could afford to be seen. When the temple hung her border, it wasn't just piety. It was the city deciding what kind of intelligence counts as holy. There were rules, and not just of taste. In Athens, across the water, the goddess's robe, the Panathenaic peplos, was woven by appointed maidens who understood the ritual weight of their work. They stitched into it a battle where gods beat back giants, a visible verdict on who had the right to rule. Even faraway Hypatia knew of that priestly cloth and what it cost to be permitted to touch it. Arachne heard stories of it from merchants who wished to flatter her. Your hands could join theirs, they would say, meaning well, and also meaning something else. Tame your talent into sanctioned patterns, and the city will love you. Arachne's yard did not have sanctioned patterns. It had deadlines and apprentices and the constant weather of a small business. She paid a tax collector who counted faster than he listened. She haggled with a wool merchant who swore his sheep drank only sky and would charge extra for the privilege. She evaluated every buyer with two minds, one that wanted her cloth to be well kept, one that wanted it to be paid for on time. She learned a truth with no poetry to it. The dignity of art depends on enough bread. Excellence grows where it is fed. Arrogance grows where it is starved and begins to bite at anything close. She also learned the soft power of a shared craft. Women gathered, talent recognized, talent the way swallows recognize an updraft. In the late afternoon, when the sun turned everybody honest, Arachne's lean-to filled with voices comparing border troubles and knot tricks, laughing without malice at mistakes that had long since been woven into useful lessons. Dion, once awkward and now deft, kept a notebook in her head of every technique and every price. She had a way of asking questions that didn't humiliate you. Why this die first? Why not space the heddles with a reed? Arachne answered as best she could. Teaching forced her to articulate what her hands had known as posture. It was in these circles that the gossip about the goddess floated and settled. The older women did not fear Athena as a thunderbolt. They respected her as a pattern, as the reason good work had a center. When they invoked her, it wasn't superstition. It was a way to keep humility and ambition in balance. We are strong because something larger steadies us, a neighbor said once, tying off a fringe with a knot that had no patience for vanity. Arachne did not argue. She thought of the way a perfect border steadies a wild field of motif. She wondered what was so wrong about wanting to sign your own name across that border. In Hypipa, foreigners were not exotic. They were Tuesday. Phoenicians with little jars of purple like captured dusk. Ionian traders with baskets of figs and philosophies. Itinerant poets with hunger behind their eyes and a gift for turning a crowd into a mirror. Stories traveled with these people, and so did ideals. Men talked about arete, the excellence that is its own justification. They argued about hubris, the kind of overreach that spoils families and invites correction from the unseeable. These weren't abstractions for Arachne. She saw excellence every time Dian's fingers remembered without being told. She saw overreach every time a bribe smoothened a wrong. The economics around Arachne's loom were not accidental. A city wants its gods to be powerful in ways that keep it safe. A city wants its artists to honor that arrangement. Arachne's insistence that her skill belonged first to her and then to whatever story the city wanted to tell was, in a quiet way, revolutionary. It threatened the trade in credit. It questioned who got to stand on a balcony and bless the work below. There was another, more intimate social truth at hand. The loom gave women a room that was theirs. Within its grammar, they could speak securely about things the street didn't always welcome. Sorrow turned into structure. Joy clipped into little repeats and tucked into corners like a private joke. Anger beaten down gently until it lay flat and useful. Arachne's claim, "I taught myself," was heard by some of these women not as a slap to Athena, but as a rare confession that sometimes the room itself teaches you, that the hours assemble into a teacher with your own face. Still, the culture had teeth. The story of Niobe, another woman who made a public claim against a goddess and learned the price of it, was told often for a reason. Public humility was the tax a woman paid for private competence. When Arachne declined to pay, people who loved her grew nervous. They began to bring up Athena's epithets. Polius, guardian of the city. Ergain, patron of craft, not as a hymn, but as a warning label. Arachne heard them and kept weaving. She had made a pact with her own abilities, and breaking it felt like more than prudence. It felt like betrayal. Then came the commission that would carry her name farther than she wanted and faster than she could manage. A noble family, the kind whose house smelled like cedar and lemon always, whose servants practiced being invisible, wanted a wedding cloth. Not a simple coverlet, but a narrative, a whole marriage's worth of hope woven into a story the couple could sleep under. They wanted fidelity without boredom, fertility without vulgarity, wealth without boast. "We want it to look inevitable," the mother said, which is the most expensive word an artist can hear. Arachne agreed, because she believed she could translate those impossibles into pattern. For weeks, she lived inside motifs, vines that braided and unbraided, birds returning always to each other's paths, a pair of hands woven so subtly into the field that you saw them only when you stopped wanting to see them. She told herself this was how she would prove a mortal hand could answer any brief the world could give it. She told herself this was how to be undeniable. When the cloth was done, the noble woman gasped in a way that wasn't performance. Payment came in full, and more commissions lined up behind it, well-mannered but urgent. The wedding feast, where Arachne was not invited to recline but permitted to stand at the edge of the room, buzzed with easy talk about talent and luck. A poet recited a few lines, improvising the famous sentence, "She needs no goddess." The laughter that followed had nothing cruel in it, and everything dangerous. People love to watch a boundary tested, especially when they believe they can reassert it later with a good story. When the old woman returned, the same patient face, the same ordinary shawl, Arachne found her waiting at dawn, as if time belonged to her. "I have seen your cloth," she said. "It sings." Let it sing of its teacher Arachne, who had written her own name into one corner in a minuscule cipher, felt heat collect just below her throat. "It does," she said. "It sings of hours and hunger, of fingers that bled and learned, of eyes that narrowed and widened and learned to see instead of want. If the goddess is in there, she will find herself." The old woman lifted a hand, as if to bless or to warn. The gesture hung undecided in the air. "There are two kinds of fall," she said. "One when the ground rises to meet you. One when you climb higher than the air that can hold you." Arachne, young, sure, brilliant, heard only a lesson in physics. Level 3. The historical perspective. Arachne's tale traveled, as tales do, hitchhiking on bread routes, and the mouths of men who like to hear their own voices filled with clever echoes. In Ephesus, a singer built a version in which she reps her father's trade and paints the god's slyness into her cloth. In Colophon, another made her an orphan, so her talent could feel more like destiny than training. By the time poets in Rome took interest, Arachne had become an instrument, a caution against hubris, a sermon on proper piety, a way to flatter a goddess by pointing out how dangerous she could be to those who forgot their place. The metamorphosis that every version eventually leans toward, the quicksilver mercy or cruelty by which a human becomes the word for the thing they loved, made the story move easily. Spiders carry their own metaphor, but if you peel away the uses men put on her, a deeper pattern shows. This is a story about who gets to claim authorship in a world where the divine is used to launder authority. In one register, Arachne insults a goddess. In another, she protests a practice, that the highest credit belongs always and only above. Her sentence, "I taught myself," is less about erasing Athena and more about inserting a mortal into the chain of causation. The ancients had a word for the energy that drives excellence. Daimon, not demon, as we now mean it, but a force that dwells in the space between a person and their power. When Arachne refused to assign her daemon a superior, she was rearranging the map of the possible. Weaving itself is not a neutral technology in myth. The fates, Moirai, measure and cut the human story as if it were cloth. The queen of the gods herself weaponizes fabric when she borrows Aphrodite's girdle to bend affection. The city of Athens stages its supremacy on a robe where gods are victorious over giants. To weave is to narrate with structure. To thread is to decide what repeats and what refuses to. Against this symbolic economy, Arachne's content becomes a kind of treason. We know from later tellers that when the contest came, she dared to depict the gods not as exemplars, but as tricksters and bullies. She wove the bad stories that polite temples prefer to forget. Whether she planned it this way from the start, or whether the plan arrived under her fingers, some part of Arachne wanted truth to register in pattern, not just power. There is also the matter of locality. Arachne is Lydian, a detail some Athenians might have enjoyed, as it allowed them to universalize their goddess while provincializing the girl. But Lydia was no backwater. Its dyes colored half the Mediterranean. Its coinage taught merchants to trust strangers. To say that a Lydian girl outmade an Athenian pattern is to poke at civic pride. The myth allows Athens to absorb the threat by turning it into a lesson. Yes, even foreigners recognize Athena's supremacy. Eventually, the transformation seals the argument. If you cannot honor the goddess with your mouth, you will spend the rest of your life honoring her with your body, an endless thread, an endless making that never signs its work. From a modern gaze, listening, as we are, with the evening gentleness we've promised, another lesson glows. The price for speaking plainly about one's own excellence is often higher when a woman speaks it. Men who boasted became epics. Women who did were taught to lower their eyes. Arachne refuses, not to scandalize, but to be exact. She asks that the map of her life include the mountain where she learned to walk. In doing so, she becomes both patron saint and warning label for every craftsperson who has felt the tug to pass credit upward and away. And yet, the old women were not entirely wrong with their caution. There is wisdom in thanking what steadies you. The idea of Athena, the thought of a mind divine enough to give shape to making, can be a blessing even if no goddess stands in your doorway disguised as a grandmother. When Arachne rejects the shared language of gratitude, she also rejects a community's way of protecting itself from the wildness of talent. Communities fear wildness because wildness does not distribute comfort evenly. Arachne's story is how a city renovates that fear into a ritual. Don't say the quiet part out loud. Don't climb higher than the air that can hold you. We are not at the contest yet, and we will not hurry there. The drama you hear in her is not the theater of divine punishment. It is the undertone of choice. She could have nodded and said the proper words and kept her career and perhaps even her life as she knew it. She could have taken her skill into the house of a noble and let it become decorative comfort. She could have moved to Athens and joined the state's cloth with her genius. Instead, she chose to stand in her own yard, beside her father's vats and her apprentice's careful hands, and say precisely the thing all makers secretly test themselves against. Let me be measured by what I make. The night is friend to such sentences. It has room for them. It has patience to trace the consequences without cheering or scolding. So we leave her there for now, on the brink, hands steady, mind bright, the old woman's warning still lingering like smoke under a roof beam. The weights on her warp are small moons. The pattern ahead is difficult and dear. She is not yet a spider. She is still a person whose art is about to intersect with story so sharply that both will change shape. And when we arrive at the contest and at what follows, we will remember this room and this yard and this city that asked for beauty and then asked, more dangerously, for humility. We will listen for the thread's small music. We will ask, as all good stories teach us to ask, whether the punishment fits the crime and whether the crime was ever a crime at all, or simply a clear sentence spoken into a windy place. The night air at Aulis smelled of tar and waiting. Ships crowded the shore like held breaths, their masts a small forest, pointing at gods who would not answer. The wind had gone on strike. Sailcloth hung flaccid. Oars lay idle as ribs. Men grew smaller under their armor. With every day the bay stayed slick and still. Someone had said Agamemnon angered Artemis, boasted on a hunt, missed a sacrifice, struck what should not be struck. And now, the goddess had pinched the world's throat until it could not exhale. Or so the story went, a tent-to-tent rumor that spoke with certainty, because fear needed certainty the way fire needs dry wood. In the house at Mycenae far away, a girl was told to pack a dress. Iphigenia was 17 in some tellings, younger in others, old enough in all to recognize a father's sudden sweetness as theater. The message came with golden dust on its hem, a promise that she would be married to Achilles, the shining one, quick-footed, quick-famed. Come to Aulis, it said, and take your place beside a man who will be sung. Her mother, Clytemnestra, read the letter and felt the ink scratch wrong against her bones. Still, she set her jaw and braided her daughter's hair with hands that had learned long ago how to make ceremony look like choice. At the shore, the future assembled a stage. Priests rehearsed. A platform was cleared. A ram bleated somewhere, as if to remind everyone of what sacrifice looks like when it stays in its lane. Iphigenia stepped from the chariot and saw a crowd arrange its face. The soldiers' hopeful hunger, the officers' careful indifference, the priest's exactitude. Achilles, when he learned what rumor had wrapped around his name, was smoke and steel. Offended, then earnest, then powerless in the way heroes often are when politics wears a god's mask. Agamemnon could not meet his daughter's eyes for long. Men who command many learn to live with short glances where love is concerned. The story is two stories at once. In one, Iphigenia is deceived and dragged to the platform, the knife a promise of wins purchased with a single life. In another, the girl looks at the fleet. So many lives braided into a plan, so many oaths stacked like firewood, and she decides, with a clarity nobody prepared her for, that Greece will not call her coward. Euripides lets her speak, and in his lines she turns from pleading to permission. "Let me go," she says. "Let me be the hinge on which this war swings open." Either way, the altar expects her neck. But the goddess, who had closed the bay, was not finished with the arithmetic of exchange. As the blade descended, the air shifted. The first hint of wind nosed the tents. A white shape flashed, a deer where a girl had been a heartbeat earlier, the platform suddenly common again beneath the priest's feet. A trick? A mercy? A correction? Artemis's ways are older than our categories. The men cried out as one body. The fleet shivered in relief. A father sank, into gratitude, into shame, into a debt he could not calculate. Iphigenia did not die at Aulis. That is the version we follow tonight. Artemis caught her away. Harpage, the poets like to say, a snatching, and carried her to the edge of the known map, to a shore where cliffs wore the sea like armor, and strangers were given other names. Taurus, they called it, the land of the Tauri, north of the Euxine Sea, where Greek imagination stacked its fears like cairns. There, in a temple that smelled of salt and iron, Iphigenia woke to a life that felt like an afterlife. She had been taken from death, but not restored to anything she recognized. She was the priestess now, and the goddess's altar in that far place required the blood of foreigners. Think of the violence here, not as spectacle, but as weight. Iphigenia stood between law and pity, her hands trained to lift a blade that once sought her throat. The men brought to her were sailors who had miscounted the coastline by a day or two, traders whose ships had followed the wrong gulls, exiles who had traded one danger for another. They spoke languages her ear could not cradle. They begged. Some cursed. A few closed their eyes and attempted to tidy their faces into bravery. She learned to guard herself against every kind of voice. She learned to listen to the small weather inside her that forecast storms of regret. Between ceremonies, she wrote to the past, composing letters on wax tablets and then smoothing them away, the words, a private tide. She dreamed of corridors in Mycenae, of the sound a mother makes when she believes the household is asleep, of a brother whose hair she had once cut straight and poorly at the brow. The temple women, who had come there by their own crooked roads, taught her how to store a life in corners, a stitch at the hem no one else knows is yours, a pebble that fits the hollow of your palm, a song sung so softly it becomes a breath. In the mornings, she burned fragrant twigs the sailors sometimes carried in their belts, myrtle, laurel, and pretended that the smoke spelled names she could hold. Years toked past like slow lamps in fog. The girl from Aulis learned to walk the cliff path without looking down. She learned how to speak to Artemis in a language that was less request than weather report. This is who I am today. This is what has been asked. Here is the knife I wish were not in my hand. The goddess, who had saved her only into a paradox, a life given back that must daily touch the boundary where life is taken. If there is a soul that can live long without learning the texture of compromise, it was not hers. Then one day, two strangers arrived who were not strangers at all. One was hunted by gods and law, the other tethered to him by a friendship that could have been sown by the fates themselves. Orestes, her brother, came because Apollo told him that only by stealing Artemis's ancient statue and bringing it home could he end the chase of the Furies and quiet the inherited howl in his blood. With him was Pallades, the friend who stands where the floor collapses. They were seized, as all foreigners were. They were brought to the temple. They were told, in ritual words that left little room for air, what would happen next. Recognition is not always lightning. Sometimes it is the slow easing of a knot. She questioned them as she must. They answered as men do, who have nothing left but truth. Names, houses, the small details only a sister would know. How Orestes hated the sound of reed flutes as a child. How he once hid a broken toy under a stone and then visited it as if it were a grave. When she understood who the world had sent to her altar, Iphigenia felt the long architecture of plan and pain and prophecy, lean and tilt. Her afterlife cracked. Something like a second rescue opened. The escape, told differently every time, is less a feat of arms than of mind. She wrote a story over top of the old one. The statue, she said, had been contaminated by the presence of the strangers. It must be purified in the sea. She led the procession down to the shore, the townspeople dutiful, the guards confident in the weight of habit. At the water's edge, with the wind finally a partner and the ships finally more than furniture, she slipped the past into the future. The three of them took the goddess and what the goddess meant and made for open water. What happened after feels like waking. In one stream of tradition, the sea was kind and the goddess approved. They sailed not to Mycenae, heavy with ghosts, but to Attica, where a new name, Tauropolos, would be braided into Artemis's titles, acknowledging both the wildness of the northern shore and the taming that ritual can do. In another stream, Iphigenia did not return to a family that had turned on itself like a snake. She went instead to a place where girls danced like bears in the goddess's honor, and learned to cross the narrow bridge between child and woman under watchful, gentle eyes. She presided. She taught. She became, in the quietest and strangest sense, a kind of answer to the question her life had posed. What should be done with a life that was spared? Her afterlife, then, was not a cloud and harp eternity. It was the life after a near death, the long day that follows a ceremony that should have ended everything. She learned the work of substitution, the deer for the girl, the ritual for the killing, the lesson for the scar. She learned to be the custodian of a different kind of sacrifice, offerings of fabric and first haircuts, coins and quiet vows, laid down by hands that trembled for reasons not always named. She could not unmake the platform at Aulis, but she could stand between blade and body more often than not, and in doing so, repay a debt crossed through with arrows and gods. Level 2. The social context war eats women's names first. In the roles of honor carved into stone, the men are listed with patronymics and places, their deaths itemized into the arithmetic of nation. The women appear as weather, wives who wait, mothers who sew, sisters who sing tragically accurate songs. Iphigenia's story refuses that quiet. It writes a girl into the machinery that starts a war, and then shows the cost that machinery extracts long after the first trumpet stops pretending to be music. At Aulis, the social technology of sacrifice is on display in its most dangerous form, the public claim that a single death can buy collective success. Ancient Greek communities were not strangers to offerings. Their calendars were stitched with ritual slaughters that fed both gods and households, but human sacrifice sat at the edge of their self-definition. Possible, powerful, repugnant, a rumor you tell about others. To propose a maiden's blood as the key to wind is to test every seam in a culture's fabric. Who authorizes such a thing? How consent is forged or forged? How men make use of women's bodies in the name of purposes that can be recited but not bled for by those who recite them. Iphigenia becomes a lens for the roles women are asked to play in war. She is a daughter, moved like a token to pay a debt her father incurred to his god and his army. She is a bride that won't be, the parody of a wedding used to set the trap. Veils and vows used as camouflage for ropes and knives. She is a priestess, given authority in a foreign temple that is both real power and a cage. She is a sister, later, whose intelligence and courage rescue men whose fame will nonetheless elbow her to the margins when the bards count on their fingers. In each role, the culture scripts her, and in each role, she revises the script, not with slogans, but with acts. Consenting where consent feels like salvage, refusing where refusal can be smuggled into ritual, substituting where substitution can save lives. Inside the temple at Taurus, the social story sharpens. The Greeks called the Tauri barbarians, an onomatopoeic word that renders unfamiliar speech as animal noise. It is easier to stomach tales of human sacrifice when you can assign them to another. The myth uses that edge of the map to dramatize what Greeks feared and denied in themselves. In Tauris, the altar drinks blood. In Greece, the altar is civilized. So the story insists. But the line will not stay where it is painted. Iphigenia's presence there, Greek, noble, literate, complicates every easy division. The knife shines the same under any sky. What the Athenians did with her story back home reveals how communities metabolize disquiet. They turned the trauma at Aulis and the terror at Taurus into festivals that trained girls how to cross thresholds with safety. At Brauron, outside Athens, girls played the bear, Ark toy, in Artemis's precinct, shedding the wild in ritual so they could assume the dignity of civic womanhood under supervision rather than under a blade. Clothing ripped from childish bodies was dedicated. Little saffron robes swished like late sunlight. In some tales, garments of women who died in childbirth were given in Iphigenia's name, an admission that the city knew which altars still demanded blood without calling it a sacrifice. In this way, the communal relies on the personal. Iphigenia's near death becomes the city's preventative measure. Cult is culture's memory palace. By giving her a role at the sanctuary, some say she served at Brauron, others that she was honored there as a heroine whose tomb received offerings. The Athenians made her story a machine for turning fear into custom. Parents could say to daughters, "The goddess who once asked for too much now asks you for a dance and a dress and some hair." The bargain between violence and order is never entirely clean, but it is more humane for having learned to speak softly. Meanwhile, the war she was meant to enable burns in the background of the social scene. Men carry their private reasons onto public ships. Kings use gods as collateral. Poets refurbish revenge into meaning. Clytemnestra, left behind with the memory of a would-be wedding and the rumor of a miracle she did not witness, becomes the other half of the social story. The woman who refuses to forgive the calculus that writes her child's name on a receipt. When Agamemnon returns from Troy, with laurels and a broken wether in his eyes, she meets him with steel. This, too, is social context, the way a community's choices return home disguised as domestic dramas. The house is where war ends up when it is finished with its public face. Finally, there is the priestesshood itself. To be a priestess of Artemis is to stand at the threshold between raw life and shaped life. Artemis is the goddess of edges, of first blood, of first births, of first hunts. She keeps the rule that wildness must learn in order to endure. Iphigenia's long afterlife in the goddess's service puts a woman in charge of limiting violence with ritual, a role that both enshrines and softens the old appetite for purchase through pain. The community wants that, even if it will not admit the origin of the desire. It wants a woman to turn the knife into choreography. Level 3. The historical perspective. Myth is a mirror that flatters or scolds depending on who lights the room. In Iphigenia's story, the Greeks held up a surface to 3 historical preoccupations: justice, war, and cult. Justice in the house of Atreus is a family heirloom with a blade. The decision at Aulis is framed as necessity. No wind without blood, no war without wind, no honor without war. But necessity is often just power, wearing an old cloak. The arc that begins with Iphigenia bends through Clytemnestra's revenge to Orestes' guilt and the Furies' pursuit, and then turns, crucially, into a civic answer. A court in Athens, weighing blood with words. The shift from vendetta to verdict, the Areopagus in Aeschylus' telling, depends on another shift that Iphigenia embodies. From human sacrifice to symbolic offering. From the altar as engine to the altar as memory. If justice is the art of replacing cycles with conclusions, then Iphigenia's rescue and reappointment mark an early rehearsal of that art. The deer takes the girl's place. The festival takes the altar's place. The court takes the family's rage and domesticates it into precedent. War is the theater, where leaders gamble other people's breaths. The windless fleet at Aulis is a portrait of military ambition, stalled by weather and conscience. History in the 5th century BCE, when Athenian playwrights staged Iphigenia's story, was already crowded with campaigns that had tested the city's soul. Euripides wrote for audiences who knew what it meant to send sons across water and to count ships as if counting warded off fate. The fable of the sacrificed maiden was a way to argue, obliquely and safely, about what wars ask and whether reasons are purchased or discovered. In the tragedy's mirror, listeners could consider the possibility that great enterprises sometimes begin with a lie, a false wedding, a misnamed ritual, and that the momentum of collective decision can drag individuals across lines they would never walk on their own. Cult is history's long memory dressed as celebration. The Taurian Artemis legend explains why Athens keeps certain rites and what they mean. A society that wants to call itself civilized tells a story in which it rescues a maiden from the far edge of barbarity and rehouses her in a sanctuary where blood is transformed into saffron, terror into dance. The origin of a statue. Did it come from Taurus? Did Orestes shoulder it through surf? Matters less than the function of the belief. It lets a city say, "We do not do what they do," while quietly acknowledging that once, perhaps, or in another register, or under another name, we did, and we learned to stop. Myths, like Iphigenia's, launder old stains into emblems, not to forget them, but to put them to work as warnings. There is also the political work of possession. By claiming that Artemis's ancient image now lives in Attica, the Athenians made geography obey story. Sanctuaries at Broron or Halai could point to a narrative that delivered prestige across the sea. Pilgrims travel for gods who have traveled. Offerings multiply when their recipients have histories. In this way, myth serves as a passport for objects and practices, granting them citizenship in a city's identity. Iphigenia is both person and paperwork, a heroine and an ideology that justifies the queue at a particular altar. The afterlife in her title, Iphigenia's Afterlife, is a modern way to name what the ancients understood as metamorphosis of role. She doesn't die. She changes jobs. But the phrase allows a wider lens. Wars have afterlives. Decisions have afterlives. Dodged deaths have afterlives, even longer than fulfilled ones. Iphigenia lives on as the answer to a question she did not ask. What becomes of a life saved by a god who uses people as counters in games mortals cannot see the board of? The humane answer the Greeks eventually write with her is this: saved lives should be spent easing other lives away from edges. If you were once the deer's replacement, become the deer for others. Take the blow, absorb the demand, convert the right. Finally, justice again, because the story cannot leave it. Was it right to ask for her? Was it right to lie to her? Was it right to accept the deer in her place and sail anyway to burn a city and count its treasures? The tragedies do not settle the account. They let you sit with the ledger open and the lamp low, and they give you company in the discomfort. Iphigenia's calm at the end of some versions is not the calm of forgetting. It is the slow-breathed knowledge that the world will always think it can buy a wind with a girl, and that the work of priests and sisters and storytellers is to make the price into a ritual no longer payable in flesh. So imagine her, years after the sea crossing, walking the colonnade of a sanctuary that smells of honey and cedar rather than iron. Girls run past, laughing the way safety laughs. In a side room hang rows of small garments dedicated to a goddess who once paused a fleet and then learned to pause a knife. Iphigenia touches the cloth, not as a queen, not as a victim, but as a keeper of exchanges. She knows what it means to be spared, and she knows what it costs to spend a sparing well. Outside, the wind arrives on time, and the ships sail only for trade. The altar smokes with cakes and fruit. Somewhere, the old story, its sharpness dulled, its lesson polished, takes its place among the other evening voices, another bridge laid gently between mortals and gods. They said he could tune a day. Morning walked straighter if Linus had played at dawn. The market's clatter learned manners. Even a dog paused with one paw lifted when his melody passed. He lived at the foot of Olympus, where the wind knew the names of stones, where shepherd boys learned to count by listening to flutes in the distance. His house was simple: fig tree, jar for rainwater, a bench worn smooth by pupils' knees. But the room where he kept his lyres felt like a small temple: wood that had learned patience, strings that remembered hands, a hush that was not empty but expectant. Orpheus came to him as a narrow-shouldered boy with eyes like fresh ink, quiet and watchful. The first time Linus put a lyre in the boy's arms, Orpheus held it the way some people hold grief, carefully, as if it might break and break him with it. "It isn't an object," Linus said softly. "It is a gate." He showed the boy how to sit so the instrument would consent to speak, how to lift the hand that plucks and lower the hand that steadies, how to feel the difference between a string that sulks and a string that waits. He taught him the old modes: Dorian for spine, Phrygian for fire, Mixolydian for shade, and the older courtesy that you do not startle a song, you invite it. Linus's own music traveled with another purpose. He had a way of finding the note beneath the note, the tone that gathers other tones like a river gathers light. People said he could match the hum of a beehive, could draw a straight line between a star's cold and the warmth in a rib cage, could take cruelty by the wrist and make it sit down until it remembered its first name. In the barley fields, reapers timed their cuts to his measures. In the women's courts, spindles moved at the tempo he preferred. He wrote a piece once that he played only for himself, a slow descent that felt like walking backward through a memory without breaking it. When he finished, the room was as calm as the surface of a deep jar. How do gods hear such things? Not as we do, with ears and nerves, but with the part of themselves that counts order and the part that dislikes being surprised. Apollo, keeper of clear song, traveler between light and law, had blessed other musicians without rancor, so the stories say. But Linus's music did something different. It did not merely please. It behaved like an instrument upon the world. Where he played, a quarrel loosened. Where he played, a child who could not sleep learned how. Where he played, the flock stopped bolting at shadows and learned to graze through thunder. A human able to bend the weather of minds. This is useful to a city and alarming to a god. Rumors attach themselves to power like ivy to stone. One telling says that Apollo grew jealous when Linus discovered a way to thread two modes so that sorrow and courage occupied the same space without arguing, an invention that gave mortals a taste of divine composure. Another telling, harsher, says that Linus dared to sing names not given him to sing, to draw up from ground and air the private patterns behind things and hum them aloud, the way a shepherd might accidentally call a wolf while calling his sheep. A more pedestrian version, the one neighbors sip, when they are feeling sensible, says that Linus corrected a prince too firmly and paid for it in the ordinary coin violence keeps in its sleeve. Linus himself was not reckless. He salted praise with caution. He taught Orpheus the danger of enchanting without permission. If a song does not let people return to themselves, he would say, it is theft dressed as tenderness. The boy listened. He learned how to lift the room and put it down again without bruising it. He learned to stop one note short of miracle. The day the curse woke had no bad omen. The figs were sweet, the goats disobedient, the noon wind exactly as unambitious as it is in late summer. Linus tuned for a small gathering, a wedding contract to be signed, a quarrel between cousins to be untangled in public before it tangled in private, a new song to be tried quietly in the corner. He began with the old hymn to the sun, clear as pouring water. He pivoted to a shepherd's call, roughened on purpose so that men who were ashamed of tears could cover theirs with laughter. Then, as the room released its held breaths, he braided a line he had kept in his pocket for months, something he had found while listening to the wind address the pine tops just after a storm. It was not louder than anything else. It simply gathered attention the way a harbor gathers boats. Heads tilted without meaning to. Shoulders fell into agreement. Hands that had come prepared to argue forgot their scripts. The sound made the room honest. A man who had cheated his brother looked up hard and realized the arithmetic would not protect him. A woman who had convinced herself she loved a man for his steadiness heard the word fear move under her affection like a fish beneath a boat. Even the little girl who had, 5 days earlier, slipped a ring from her aunt's dish and hidden it under a fig root, felt her heart knock, and she made a plan to put it back. This was not magic. It was attention, organized. Perhaps that was the trespass. The gods do not forbid truth. They forbid mortals from holding too much of it in one hand. A breeze moved through the room, though no door had opened. The lamp flame bent and did not right itself. Linus felt the slightest fatigue in his fingers, as if someone had added a single grain to each tendon. He ended the piece as gently as a cup set down on a sleeping friend's table. The room woke like a meadow after a shadow passes. The cousins embraced and meant it. The bride's smile stopped performing and began to exist. And then, afterward, in the alley behind the house, a messenger waited in the shade. He wore no device, claimed no patron, spoke as if repeating what he did not understand. "Stop playing that song," he said. "All of it? Number. The new one. The one that makes men lay down stones they were about to throw." He said, there had been dreams in the temple. 3 priests waking at once with the taste of copper in their mouths. He said a laurel tree near the altar had gone temporarily out of season, and then, embarrassed, resumed its greenery. He said nothing about punishment. He did not need to. Linus smiled as men do when death has outlined itself in their day, and they decide to be precise with the minutes. "Tell whoever sent you," he said, "that I serve the same light they do. If my song has stepped on their robe, I will stitch the hem the messenger left with a look that was not quite contempt and not quite pity." That night, Linus did not sleep. He tuned and retuned and asked the instrument to reveal where he had overreached. He found no arrogance in the song, only usefulness. Before dawn, he woke Orpheus and walked with him to the river. The boy's feet were bare. The stones were blunt with moss. "Listen," Linus said, "to the spaces between things." They stood shoulder to shoulder, while the water learned the shore by heart. If they forbid you to sing one name of the world, he said, learn two others. There are 100 honest ways to bless a room. The next day, in the square, a prince who believed correction was insult demanded a song for his triumph at the hunt. Linus obliged and flattered, and then, unable to resist himself, played the small braided line again, not as command, not as rebuke, but as offering. The prince's jaw set. Some say he lifted a spear and made a teacher into a warning. Others say a sharp stone flew from a hand eager to please power. Some versions make the god explicit. An arrow that no mortal archer had nocked found its way into music's center and broke it from the inside. However the blow was delivered, the song shattered into silence, and the silence had weight. Orpheus gathered his teacher as carefully as he had once gathered a lyre. On his lips, the first I, Linus, threatened to become grief's oldest refrain. But he swallowed it and chose another song, a low, even thread to carry Linus across the minutes that remained. When the town buried him, they planted a vine by the marker. It took easily. In fall, reapers sang as they cut, and their chorus kept the old syllable, not as a wound, but as a hinge. Eilenon, the breath that turns a lament into a harvest's rhythm. Linus's gate did not close. It widened. The cursed song was not the one that drew envy. It was silence itself, the enforced hush that tries to frighten art from doing the work of making people ready for themselves. Level 2. The social context. To a Greek ear, music was not wallpaper. Musike, the art under the muse's wide shawl, trained bodies and tempers as surely as running drills did. Boys learned to sing before they learned to argue in the square. Modes had reputations the way neighborhoods do. Dorian made you stand your ground without swagger. Phrygian warmed your courage, but could set your pulse too hot. Lydian, sweet and pliant, softened a room that needed softening and sometimes softened it too much. A city guarded its modes the way it guarded its fountainheads. The wrong song at the wrong hour could tilt a festival toward frenzy, or make a war council sentimental when it needed to be cold. Music's authority made it suspect. Kings wanted it near but obedient. Priests wanted it pure but effective. A gifted singer could ease a tax, bind a marriage more tightly than law, nudge a jury without touching it. That is a lovely power when it calls people back from cliffs. It is a dangerous one when it teaches them they could have chosen not to walk there in the first place. Linus's way, finding the undertone that aligns a room, threatened several industries at once: the trade in brinkmanship, the profit made on confusion, the prestige that comes from being the only person who can make a crowd behave. The social world would rather bless charisma than understand it. It likes a miracle if it can be scheduled. It loves a god because a god arrives with temples and fees. But a mortal who can reliably deliver what gods are praised for, calm, clarity, concord, puts hierarchies in a bad light. If a song can do for free what a ritual sells, who owns the song? The safe answer is the god. The safer policy is to discourage mortals from inventing too much. And knowledge itself can be volatile. Linus taught that certain intervals could move grief without spilling it, that a chord placed just so could make shame and relief sit together for the length of a breath and negotiate terms. He made ethics into acoustics. In a world where most education passed from mouth to ear in market squares and stoa and women's courtyards, such knowledge traveled quickly and democratically. That frightened people who believed virtue must be enforced rather than cultivated. If a craftsman listens and becomes kinder, where do you put the magistrate who thrives on fines? If a festival remembers how to be joyous without tipping into harm, Who needs the watchman's stick? So the culture ran its usual safety protocols. It told a story in which overreach meets correction. It made Linus a caution. In one tradition, a teacher too sharp for his own good scolds a high-born pupil, Hercules in some versions, and earns a blow that says, "Know your place." In another, a mortal too near the son of Apollo's competence is reminded that the god owns the right to absorb and define music's uses. It also scattered Linus into multiple figures: lament-made person, teacher, son of Apollo, brother to Orpheus, so that no single version could be held up for long as a manifesto. Diffusion is one of society's polite weapons, yet the same social fabric quietly preserved what it pretended to rebuke. Women at the loom sang Eilinon as they bent the day to shape. Reapers at vintage time braided the syllable into their work songs, turning grief into pace and pace into common strength. Children learned the refrain without learning its origin, which is often history's gentlest mercy. And pupils kept coming to spare rooms and fig-shaded benches to learn how to sit, how to listen, how to sound a note that leaves a room better than it found it. Orpheus carried the careful version of his master's gift into places where kings had no jurisdiction: caves, forests, hearts. In this way, the social meaning of Linus becomes clear: a community that trusts music, trusts itself to be improved by attention rather than force. A community that fears music, fears the possibility that order could be coaxed rather than commanded. Linus stands at that choral center. The curse in his story is not the god's jealousy so much as the community's ambivalence about gentler power. Level 3. The historical perspective. The Greeks kept a refrain like a seed in their mouth and planted it wherever work or sorrow needed company. Linus, sometimes at vintage, sometimes in mourning, sometimes both, lingers in old texts, not as a fully told tale, but as a sound readers are expected to recognize. In one long-remembered scene, a boy on a shield of bronze sings the Linus as he plays among vines. Elsewhere, historians notice with surprise that Egyptians chant something similar and argue whether the song traveled like a vessel or sprouted spontaneously wherever grief met harvest. Whether Linus was first a person or first a cry matters less than what the myth accomplishes. It gives a human face to a cultural practice and a story spine to a syllable. Attaching a life to a lament does political and ritual work. It lets a city say, "We are civilized, we do not overstep," and then retain a song that acknowledges overstepping as perennial. It explains why music has rules without pretending that rules can cage what music is for. Apollo's patronage of the lyre and Dionysus's love for the aulos, the breathy, urgent pipe, divide the musical world into bright and dark, day and festival night. Linus lives in the seam. His ordered playing calms like Apollo, but what his melody does, unmask, combine, reconcile, is closer to the god with ivy in his hair. The story that he drew divine envy is a way of admitting that art's most humane uses make hierarchies nervous. Other myths remember this tension and mark its boundary with flayed skin, Marsyas, or ruined ears, the sailor who mocked a god and learned silence the hard way. Linus is gentler and more subversive. He is not punished for a contest he demanded, but for a competence that made contest unnecessary. He embodies the idea that art could hold a room so well that law becomes a last resort, not a first recourse. Histories of education in Greece, paideia, place music alongside numeracy and gymnastics as co-equal shapers of citizens. The Linus tradition, scattered and stubborn, is the shadow commentary. Beware the lesson that convinces better than it compels. His connection to Orpheus, sometimes teacher, sometimes brother, folds the myth into later currents. Orphic poems and rituals promise purification and a map through the underworld's bureaucracy. Their songs not just pleasant, but useful to souls. If Orpheus learned from Linus the ethics of enchantment, influence without theft, persuasion that returns the listener to himself, then Linus becomes the missing prologue to a long argument about what art is permitted to do. The dark side in the title is not the sinister note in music, but the shadow thrown by institutions when they see art doing their work with more kindness. Historically, too, the figure of Linus behaves like an etiology for a widespread Mediterranean phenomenon, the harvest lament that admits loss even as it counts bounty. Vines drip sweetness, and someone remembers a child lost to dogs, a teacher struck down, a god who demanded more than was reasonable. The refrain stitches contrasts until the cloth holds. In the performing of it, communities practice what they profess to want from their courts and councils: the ability to absorb pain without multiplying it, and jealousy. Let's keep that word honest. The gods in these stories are often less jealous than the humans who speak for them. Priests dream and call it oracle. Princes strike and call it justice. When a musician steadies a square better than an edict does, those who live by edicts feel smaller. Myth grants them an alibi. Apollo commanded, Apollo frowned. Apollo shook out his quiver. But notice what survives. Not the prohibition. The song. The proverb that if you sing too well, a god will hear you is paired with a counter-proverb that if you do not sing, the world grows coarse. Communities choose, then, not whether to risk art, but how to steward it. So imagine, in a soft-lit room after a vintage, an old singer teaching a child to carry the chorus that bears a dead man's name. Not to summon tears for their own sake, not to impress a neighbor, but to remind hands how to move together at the speed of kindness. He explains the breath between Ai and Linen, that little hinge that lets a body turn from grief to work without lying to either. He does not speak of jealousy, because jealousy cannot survive exposure to such small, clear mechanics. He speaks, instead of Linus, as if he had just stepped out to trim a string and would be back by dusk, ready to tune the day again. And perhaps he is. Perhaps every time a room remembers itself, with the help of a melody humble enough to be mistaken for air, Linus keeps his appointment with time. The cursed song remains cursed only in the way all good tools are: easily misunderstood, sometimes misused, always needed. The gods, if they listen now, do so with a different kind of attention, not the twitch of threatened rank, but the relief of delegation. Order is a heavy instrument. It cannot live on altars alone. It needs hands. The night has carried us this far, and now the three roads we've walked, thread, wind, and song, enter the same square. You can feel the air tighten the way it does before a bell is struck. Somewhere, a loom waits with its weights like small moons. Somewhere, an altar remembers a girl's pulse. Somewhere, a lyre leans against a bench, already knowing which note it will begin with. The gods, if they listen, are not thrones tonight, but attentions. Athena, like a straight line. Artemis, like a held breath. Apollo, like a bright edge. And the humans, the beautiful hazard of them, are about to step where rules thin. Arachne ties off one border and begins another. She has spent all afternoon weaving not the owl, but what the owl knows. Angles of air, intelligence turned into glide. Now, in the heart of the cloth, she threads stories nobody puts on temple walls. A bull that is a disguise and a theft, a shower of gold that is not a blessing, a swan that leaves a girl with a crown and a grief. She is not shouting, she is recording. Each shuttle pass says, I see. Each tightened weft says, that, too, belongs to the pattern. The room holds still. Old women stare with approval they are afraid to admit. Dion's lips part at the way color can tell the truth without raising its voice. In Aulis and far beyond, time is another fabric. Iphigenia stands on a different shore now, the Taurian one, the wind cold and honest. The plan is almost a hymn. Purify the statue, carry it to the sea, let ritual become rope and sail. Orestes' eyes are the eyes of a man who has spent too long being chased by a family's memory. Pylades' hands, steady on the prow, look born to promise and to keep it. Iphigenia speaks the words a priestess must speak, and means something else beneath them. She has learned the grammar of substitution, and now writes a sentence that will deliver 3 lives and a goddess's name into daylight. And at the foot of Olympus, Linus tunes, he has decided, after the messenger, after the tree that forgot its season, after the dream the priests could not digest, to play the braided line again, not as defiance, not as apology, but as clarity. The square is full of ordinary peril. A boastful boy with a new spear, a man with too much wine and an old argument, a pair of cousins whose grievance has learned their faces better than they have. Linus sets the first chord where breath resets itself. He draws sorrow and courage together until they stop pretending they are enemies. The room consents to be better than it was. 3 actions, 3 proximities to a boundary. Arachne's cloth edges toward verdict. Iphigenia's procession edges toward open water. Linus's melody edges toward the authority that doesn't need a seal. What crosses first is not a line, but a thought. That human making can correct power without breaking reverence. That mercy can be smuggled through form. That a room can be restrained with kindness faster than law can sharpen a spear. The air answers. In Hippaipa, the old woman no longer looks like a woman. The yard shrinks and holds its ground the way a shore does when the sea becomes a pinion. Athena is present, and presence is a kind of temperature. The weave on Arachne's beam gleams with a confidence that might be mistaken for insolence. The goddess's eyes take it all in. The borders that steady a field. The field that tells the stories temples prefer to list as rumor. She asks a question without moving her mouth. Who taught you to record the weather of gods? Arachne answers with the clear rudeness of exactness. Ours did. Hands did. The contest has the politeness of tragedy. Both know, before the first thread is tested for weight, that the cost has already been counted. On the Taurian shore, the procession is obedient to the script written for it by people who cannot imagine new endings. The townsfolk murmur dutifully. The guard's spears are set to the angle habit chooses when habit believes it will keep being allowed. Iphigenia walks like a woman who has done this before, in smaller ways. A rearranged prayer here, a shortened cruelty there. She lifts the goddess not as an object, but as an idea. The right to redirect a blade, the right to name a purification that purifies more than it says. The surf reaches and withdraws, a metronome patient with mortal timing. Orestes feels, for the first time in years, a plan that is not hungry for his blood. In the square, by the fig tree, the prince, with the coin-bright eyes, hears a note that makes him briefly ordinary. just a man under a roof, held by a sound that teaches his bones the shape of fairness. It is a frightening relief. He has lived long on applause and the leverage of fear. The note threatens his mastery by proposing a gentler one. He raises his hand. History has always been attentive to such hands. In one telling, he throws. In another, he calls for someone else to throw. In a third, he is the god's instrument without knowing. The details behave like shadows, shifting, accurate to nothing but the fact that something darker falls. The moments close like a hand. Arachne's thread tightens into consequence. A human becomes the emblem of endless making, the punishment shaped to the passion. No scream, just a long, shivering yes to the logic the city demands. If you will not speak our gratitude, you will spend your days performing it. She does not die. She diminishes into another kind of persistence. Work without signature becomes her sentence and her prayer. The goddess leaves exactly the amount of mercy that makes a warning function. Iphigenia steps off the last stone onto the planks, and the statue, heavy, older than any city's current name, sets its weight like a second wind. The guards miss a count. Somebody laughs, thinking this is a rehearsal joke. The boat slides. The sea receives. A gull maps the air for them as if it had been paid. On shore, the ritual uneasiness becomes anger, too late to be useful. By the time the town realizes a story has departed with its most precious word, oars have found their measure. Linus's song is interrupted. It does not end. It is ended. The silence after has a sick shine. Orpheus finds his teacher's weight and arranges him on the ground the way a man returns a tool to its box. Not fixable, still beloved. In people's throats, the cry that bears his name forms itself, then chooses a more useful shape. It becomes work. It becomes pace. It becomes the little hinge that lets grief and duty share a cup without spilling. Jealousy believes it has won something. It has not noticed that the room remembers how to sit together, exposed and safe, without instruction. Now the roads rejoin. What makes this a climax is not thunder. It is recognition. The sudden, precise sight of what connects three lives that never touched. Arachne, Iphigenia, Linus. Each practiced an art that made the world less reliant on fear. Weaving that tells the truth about power. Priestcraft that retools slaughter into symbol. Music that coaxes consent from chaos. Each incurred a charge of arrogance from those who police credit. Who told you that you may do this? Each answered with a version of the same sentence. My hands did. My hours did. My listening did. Each learned the price for speaking the quiet part clearly. And yet the world does bend, even if it won't admit who taught it. Athens will wrap itself in a robe that celebrates victory, but knows, in its borders, how much quiet work goes into keeping a city upright. A sanctuary will train girls to cross a dangerous threshold with saffron and song instead of a blade. A harvest will keep a syllable that was once a man, the chorus carrying him the way a river carries light. The room of the night grows larger to fit the aftermath. You can hear the pulse slow. We are in the same square, but the bell has been struck, and the air has learned its echo. Arachne's loom stands where we left it. The cloth on the beam looks the same to eyes untaught, but to anyone who has watched, it is now a testimony and a receipt. In another city, along another sea, a priestess sets a statue down and feels in her palms the last tremor of being owned by a moment. She lets it pass, and something like peace replaces it. In a market where the dust has settled, men who are hot with triumph or anger find themselves speaking in level voices, as if the note lingers under their words. The resolution begins not with endings, but with translations. The sharpness of each act softens into practice. Arachne's metamorphosis becomes the proverb craftspeople pass around like a sharpened tool. Sign what you make, but bow to what steadies you. Iphigenia's escape becomes festival, a safe rehearsal of a danger that should never return. Linus's death becomes refrain, a way to move bodies together at the speed of kindness. The gods, for their part, look less like jealous owners and more like guardians of shape, flinching when form is broken roughly, relieved when mortals learn to bend without breaking. Do the heroes become shadows? Not in the sense of disappearing. Rather, they join that quiet company that lives at the edge of useful things. In a border pattern, where two colors change places without argument, a Lydian girl's stubborn exactness hides in the geometry. In a saffron robe swishing past a column, the memory of a daughter who did not die at the altar steadies a mother's breath. In the tiny rest between Ai and Linon, a teacher's hand is felt on the shoulder of a boy who will one day sing a city back to itself. Their faces fade, which is mercy. Faces can be liabilities, but their decisions remain as muscle memory in the culture's body. Words keep them. Not only the words of poets and priests, though those help, but the smaller words of work. Tighten, release, lift, bear, listen, return. The loom's verbs, the altar's verbs, the lyre's verbs. Say them, and you will feel the day reorganize itself under your hands. The stories ask for nothing louder than attention. They teach that pride is not the refusal to bow, but the refusal to see. That sacrifice is a poor tool unless it learns to mean instead, rather than instead of you. That art is not a charm, but a discipline that returns us to ourselves without theft. The city exhales again. Lamps gutter and steady. A sea breath reaches even here, salt over stone. If you tilt your head, you can imagine the three of them moving in the far room of time the way constellations move. Arachne, a neat geometry. Iphigenia, a calm arc over dark water. Linus, a line so simple it is mistaken for air. The square that gathered to witness their crossings disperses, but more carefully than it arrived. People step lightly, as if a thread might be underfoot. And the gods? They remain where good rules remain, in the part of us that wants shape and fairness, and a standard that can be taught by story. Athena's palm still weighs cloth and finds it true. Artemis still approves a substitution when it saves both dignity and life. Apollo still asks that music be clear enough to dignify daylight. They have learned, perhaps, to hear praise in the quiet running of things done well. They have learned to be thanked by outcome, so the climax resolves into a posture we can keep. Not triumph, not defeat, but a measured gratitude for the arts that let human beings resist the laziness of fate. The rest is gentle conversation, between fingers and thread, between wind and oath, between note and nerve. Our three have stepped back into their places beyond the edge of sight. What remains is the path they cut, wide enough for a city to walk without stumbling. And as the circle of light narrows, as the night continues its long, unhurried work of turning noise into hush, the stories stay, caught in the borders of memory, folded into ritual, braided into harvest song, ready to be spoken again when the day has made us clumsy, and we need to remember how to move. Perhaps myths survive, not because they are true, but because they touch something eternal. Not eternal like marble, cold and proud, unwilling to change, but eternal like rhythm, the way waves keep learning the same shore, the way breath finds its count after surprise, the way a hand, even in a strange century, still knows how to tighten, release, and carry. When the names blur and the faces turn to faint profiles, what remains is a set of movements the world keeps practicing. To weave what is seen and what should be seen into one fabric. To turn danger into right and pass safely through. To tune a room until it remembers its better self. Thread, wind, song. They outlast the statues that once claimed them and go on working inside ordinary hours. Listen closely, and you can hear their small instructions. From Arachne, a lesson that is older than God's and still younger than our impatience. Tell the truth in the pattern. Do it without cruelty. Do it without apology. Let the border hold. Let the field be honest. If praise wants to climb upward and vanish into a story about thunder, lean gently and keep some of it near the ground where hands live. If pride arrives, because it will, teach it a better posture, not a chin raised against the sky, but a spine straight enough to carry what you've made. Somewhere, a loom ticks, a patient metronome, and the shuttle's path redraws the difference between defiance and clarity. From Iphigenia, the quiet grammar of rescue. When a knife has a job, sometimes the job can be changed. The world will call it purification, substitution, festival. Words that make it safe to say in public what love would say in private. Not this body, not today. Let memory keep the altar, but let practice keep the girl. Trade iron for saffron, threat for choreography, fear for a bridge, walk together. In her long afterlife, she becomes a custodian of thresholds, teaching that survival is not an accident you hoard, but a resource you spend carefully for others. From Linus, the undertone the heart recognizes even if it has forgotten the tune. A note that invites a crowd to be decent at the same time without anyone losing their face. The song is not a spell. It is a tuning fork touching the bright bone of attention. It does not flatter. It steadies. It does not seize. It returns. Jealous ears may bristle. Institutions may ask for silence, but the chorus travels anyway, tucked into harvest and housework until it becomes a hinge, Linon, where grief turns toward work without lying about either. These are not just tales we tell at dusk. They are tools. They give names to actions we still need. Arachne's story sits in every craft that refuses to decorate a lie. Iphigenia's escape breathes in each policy that replaces harm with rehearsal. Linus's melody hums under meetings that end in mercy instead of scorekeeping. Call them myths if you like. They will answer to other names. Conscience, care, craft. If that sounds grand, look closer. Eternity here is built of small, durable motions. A thumb finding the warp's tension. A palm pressing a statue's old weight and feeling it agree to move. A fingertip pausing above a string to let the rest between notes do its work. Myth brings the horizon down to the size of a gesture and then sends it back out, enlarged by use. It says, you will not outrun the sea, but you can learn its habit. You will not command the wind, but you can learn where it listens. You will not own a room, but you can make it ready to welcome what is best in it. Art, memory, and the human voice. These are the bridges we keep repairing. Art is the structure we build so that truths have somewhere to sit without being knocked over by weather. It is not an ornament, but a frame, not a trumpet, but a tuning. The cloth that shows what power did, the ritual that turns demand into offering, the melody that refuses to humiliate. These are not luxuries. They're civic furniture, as necessary as steps and cups and shade. Memory is the way a community refuses to let its wisdom evaporate. It wears many outfits, a border motif nobody notices until they need it. A festival staged at the edge of town where girls rehearse stepping safely into their names. A harvest cry that keeps a teacher walking beside the living. Memory does not always remember the facts. It remembers the procedures that preserved us. Trade blood for saffron. Trade silence for song. Trade borrowed thunder for the work of hands. And the voice, what a humble instrument, what a stubborn one. It cracks. It tires. It has no armor, but it can cross a room faster than any law and carry more tenderness than any edict. Spoken softly, it can persuade pride to become accuracy, panic to become pace. When it tells a story, it is not issuing orders, it is planting rhythms. People leave with those rhythms in their legs and discover, later, that they turn more gently. Night belongs to such recognitions. Day divides. Tasks, loyalties, noise. Night gathers. Over the Aegean, the water keeps its long conversation with moonlight. Each wave a sentence gently amended by the next. Islands lie like punctuation in a paragraph too wide to read at once. On a ridge above a cove, time breathes a small, warm story into the air. Down on the stones, fishers coil their ropes by feel, the fibers rasping with the comfort of a repeated task. Lamps tip a little in the breeze and correct themselves, proud in their modest way. Above, constellations hold still with an old patience. The bear leans, the lyre smolders, the weaver's stars lie in their measured scatter. No one needs to know their catalog. It is enough to let the eyes rest where distances arrange themselves into meaning. Once, a girl looked up from a beam and imagined these points as weights keeping her warp true. Once, another girl looked up from a dark sea and read, between those lights, permission to live where her name could be used for blessings. Once, a teacher and a student stood under them before dawn and learned to hear the space that carries sound. The wind comes in from the invisible, touches stone, olive, skin, and moves on. It is neither message nor verdict. It is company. It sidles along a colonnade where saffron hems whisper past. It noses at a yard where a loom is covered for the night, the cloth on the beam smelling faintly of dye and effort. It slides across the lip of a clay cup and makes a tone so soft you might spend a lifetime learning to hear it. If you listen, really listen, you can almost make out the words the past prefers. Not commandments, not slogans, just the verbs we keep using. Hold, loosen, carry, return. The sea, too, keeps talking, but never to instruct. It speaks in rhythms that admit no hurry. The breakers erase and redraw the same line until even a worried mind learns to accept revision. Far out, a dark shape moves. Someone late, someone brave. And a single oar's flash catches starlight and throws it back toward land, as if to say, I see you. There is a moment, most nights, when the city shakes off its applause and sits like a person who has been busy reading aloud and now wants to breathe quietly. That is when stories do their finest work. They loosen the knot, the day tighten. They replace spectacle with proportion. They do not make promises. They offer company. They say, here is how someone else faced a boundary. Here is how they failed. Here is how they mended. Take what helps. Leave the rest at the door for tomorrow. And so we leave our three where they most like to be, at the edge of usefulness, almost invisible. Arachne is present whenever a craftsperson tests a pattern for honesty and refuses to let beauty excuse forgetting. Iphigenia is present whenever a community chooses rehearsal over harm and calls it celebration without blushing. Linus is present whenever a room's temperature lowers without anyone losing dignity, and someone breathes for the first time all day as if the air had been cleaned. The night holds them lightly. The islands let their silhouettes soften. Olive leaves turn their pale undersides to the sky. Somewhere in the hills, a dog hears nothing worth saying and settles. On the Acropolis, marble drinks star cold and becomes a thought rather than a monument. Between the houses, narrow streets learn the trick of being rivers of shadow lit from the banks. At a threshold, a child presses a thumb into a little cake of wax and looks up, surprised that the world has room for such exact, tender marks. Perhaps myths survive not because they are true, but because they touch something eternal. If you want to know what that eternity feels like, you do not have to go far or back. Touch the cool of stone at dusk. Smell the salt that teaches the air to taste sharper. Put 2 fingers on a string and feel it ache to be kind. Lay a palm against a beam, still warm from hands. Say a name softly, not to conjure anyone, but to remember that you are the kind of creature that can carry something delicate across time. And then let the wind have the rest. It will pass over the water and the hills and the roofs and take with it a few of our words, a few of our better movements. Out there, beyond whatever lights we've set to make ourselves brave, the sea will keep its counsel, and the stars will keep their posts, and the old stories, patient, serviceable, will drift in the dark like friendly boats, ready to come ashore again the next evening, when another room needs its loom steadied, its altar softened, its voices tuned. The lamps have done their good work and ask to rest. One by one, they gutter, lean, and bow out. The courtyards take back their shadows, and the streets learn again how to be quiet rivers of stone. The market's last echo loosens from the colonnade and goes walking somewhere no one needs it. Up on the hill, marble becomes moonlight's memory. Down by the shore, ropes darken and cool, and a single late boat draws an even line through the harbor, as if underlining the day. The images we carried return to their places with unhurried grace. The loom stands under its cloth. The small terracotta waits the color of sleep. Thread keeps its tension without asking for eyes. In another room, a cedar chest hangs the saffron hems where they prefer to breathe. A bronze hook remembers, lightly, the weight of a goddess's name. Somewhere near a fig tree, a lyre rests on its side, one string still whispering the last thing it learned and will teach again when morning makes a request. Athens lets its shoulders drop. Olive leaves turn their pale undersides to the night breeze. The Acropolis is less a fortress now than a thought you can hold without lifting your hands. On rooftops, jars of water take the stars and make them smaller and kinder. A watchman, having counted what can be counted, taps his staff once and decides to believe the rest will keep. Our 3 companions are content to be almost invisible, present at the edges where usefulness likes to live. Arachne remains in the honest border, where 2 colors trade places without quarrel. Iphigenia waits in the safe rehearsal, where a blade is a gesture and then a lesson and then nothing at all. Linus lingers in the rest between syllables, where a room remembers itself and chooses mercy without being told. They do not ask to be seen. They ask only to be used well. So we thank the era in the way it prefers, by keeping its small, durable motions. Tighten, release. Lift, bear, listen, return. The old gods, set free tonight from their statues, go back to being what they were when they were kindest, the shapes that steady human making. Athena leaves a straightness in the grain. Artemis leaves a clear path across a threshold. Apollo leaves a tone that makes light behave. The sea rehearses its old paragraph and finds itself satisfied with the revision. The wind, having checked every door, moves on. A dog decides no announcement is necessary and curls into the square that fits him. Somewhere, a child, surprised by how much room there is in the dark for careful things, presses a thumb into wax and leaves a mark that will learn, tomorrow, to be a seal. What remains of the evening is simple and good. The city breathing evenly, the stars keeping unremarkable promises, the stories settling like friendly boats just beyond the breakwater. They will be there when they're needed. They always are. We step back from the circle of light, not poorer, but steadier, carrying a little rhythm in our hands that makes the next task kinder to do. Good night, old hills. Good night, measured stones. Good night, patient water and the narrow bridges it teaches us to build. The loom will wait. The altar will keep only smoke. The lyre will remember the note without holding it hostage. And so, 3 forgotten myths drift back into silence, waiting for another night to be remembered.